Good afternoon. It is Friday, the 1st of April 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We will be joined by live Skype link by David Scott, Northern Exposure from north of the border. Well, before we get into the delights of politics in UK, the weather. Sunny in London, apparently, Mike. I don't know how that came about. It's pretty grey and chilly in Plymouth. It's chilly, very windy in the Isle of Man. Rhonda's looking a bit cold and gloomy. Coventry is cold. So it's a mixed bag, but I'm told it's going to be dry over the weekend.
Good.
I'm going to allow you to continue for here because I'm not sure I can pronounce this word.
Well, this is David's word of the week, Scott's word of the week, and it is Huntegauk. Is that correct?
That's it. Spot on. Well done. Yes, and it's a Scots word meaning April Fool. Huntegauk, as in hunt the gauk. A gauk being a fool or a cuckoo.
And who have you in mind?
Oh, we have a cast of thousands today. There's several people in the Scottish Government, at the very least, that fall into that category. We'll get there in a moment.
Okay.
Well, perhaps this starts us off, Brian.
Well, we were just stunned at this because there's been success in the petition to ban David Cameron from returning to UK after his Lanzarote holiday. There was a sudden, massive increase in support for that campaign. And in fact, people have been out on the streets celebrating now that it's known that David Cameron is effectively locked out of the country. I don't know whether you had caught up with that headline at all, David.
That one had passed me by, actually, Brian, but that's wonderful news.
It is, yeah. So it'll cheer us up. We're going to need it because I think you've got George Osborne coming up next, Mike.
Yes, the other April Fool. Here he is. I said today Britain deserves a pay rise. Well, that's brilliant. We're now getting the national living wage. And here is his article in the Sun. So, David, what do you make of this national living wage? I think I know what you're going to say, but what do you make of this national living wage? It is got to be one of the best political moves this government has ever made, and I say that bearing in mind this is the 1st of April.
It's certainly a political move. We have to be very clear as to what it is. It's a law that says giving somebody a job is illegal. In fact, you could go to jail ultimately for giving someone a job. It can only have one effect, which is to increase unemployment. We'll get to the whole issue regarding the steel industry. We have many industries in this country struggling, and we have employment opportunities lessening all the time. And we have a government that is, for political short-term gain, passing laws to make it illegal to give someone a job, passing laws that even on their own estimate will result in 60,000 people losing the jobs they already have, and the number may be much, much higher than that.
Well, indeed, the number likely will be, because we mentioned steel, and here we go. The Daily Mirror today saying that the steel crisis could cost 40,000 jobs if no buyer can be found for Tata. I would suggest that will be the case no matter whether a buyer is found or not, because the only likely buyer that we're going to see is some kind of private equity asset stripping organization. So that's pretty much the situation. Tata Steel crisis, UK government putting China's interests first. What's your view on the whole China aspect of this?
Well, this is state intervention by China. This is state support. The Chinese steel industry is not more efficient than ours. The Chinese steel industry is vastly oversized. There's been far too much investment, and it's losing $1 billion a month. Now, what would normally happen in a free market in that situation? Then all the marginal players would go bust. The banks who'd lent them the money would probably go bust as well. And the entire industry would be much smaller in very rapid order, and then the problem being sorted, we could all go forward. That's not what's happening. The Chinese state's getting involved. It's supporting its steel industry out of taxation, and as a result, because we are in a global economy, our steel industry is by default the marginal producer that must go bust. This is not a situation that I find particularly acceptable.
Well, going back to that slide, Brian, there's a bit more to this than meets the eye.
Well, I did a bit of work, and I have to say I was helped by somebody who gave us a pointer a couple of days ago and said, were you aware that? What they were talking about was this, that Common Purpose, our very own political charity, is boasting that it's been providing leadership training to Tata Steel in order to help them set up even better plants in India. So we have Common Purpose, which of course has sucked in huge amounts of public money, UK government money, European money, is boasting that it is putting the ideology in to help what Tata Steel does to expand in India. And I think there can only be one thing we're going to say, is that we've now got Common Purpose as a political charity being paid by the state to undermine British jobs. You have to read this article on the Common Purpose website just to grasp what they're talking about. Cultural leadership, cultural intelligence. We're going to close down steel plants in South Wales in order to promote Indian steel. And this is a charity being paid for, basically dipping its hand into public money. But if we get in a bit further, it gets better, because we come to this man. Here he is, diplomat David Landsman, who actually heads up Tata Europe. So Management Today, with a big glowing article on this man who's got the task of bringing some unity to a business that has brands as diverse as Jaguar, Land Rover, Tetley Tea, Taj Hotels. We've got the picture of the steely-eyed, no pun intended, gentleman there. And what's his background? Well, it's absolutely fascinating, because he hasn't got a background in anything to do with sort of industry. He's got a background as a diplomatic man working in places such as Greece. And then he simply hops across in order to take control of this huge operation. But let's look at his language here. It says his official title is Executive Director, Tata Limited, but he describes himself as the geography head of Europe, and he's going to bring some unity and common purpose to this sprawling conglomerate. And we're now seeing what that means. It means that they're going to completely trash British industry in order to help set up better industries in India and other places overseas. And if you want to check up on this man, and I think there's a lot of questions to be asked. He's an expert in linguistics. He's promoting common purpose in his agenda. He's worked for the government, but also De La Rue, which I think you know a little bit about, Mike, is mentioned in his career history there.
Well, De La Rue is the company that prints money, so they print banknotes.
Okay, so they've got to be pretty well connected in with government. So here we are, we've got a former British government man helping collapse British strategic infrastructure using common purpose. David, I was quite astonished when I came onto this. Somebody has said that the Welsh Parliament has been recalled in order to discuss steel. I wonder whether they will be discussing the fact that Glynis Kinnock was one of the core supporters of the political charity Common Purpose and refused to help expose it in the early days.
I suspect they won't be, but the whole role here of Common Purpose is indeed fascinating. They talk about their intelligence, but they don't mention economic intelligence, because we shouldn't be building more steel plants anywhere in the world at the moment, because there's a huge oversupply. That needs to be corrected, but it needs to be corrected on terms which don't, in fact, export all of the resource and all of the jobs out of one country to another for political and not economic reasons. There's a case for having the International Division of Labour. It makes us all wealthier. Trade is good, but what we're seeing here is rampant manipulation, and certainly not free trade. very much skewed trade.
Well, we should point out that you have a vested interest in this discussion, David.
I do. I have a background which comes from a steelworking family. The chap here in the front row, third from the right, is my grandfather, and that's him in Calderbank Steelworks, the first purpose-built steelworks in Scotland. In 1930, no, third from the right, missed, one over. The first purpose-built steelworks in Scotland, that was 1930, and he worked in front of the open hearth furnaces in very difficult conditions, and that was his job at that point. And in my family background, we went through the whole issue of the steel mill in the steel town or steel village, Calderbank's quite a small place, closing, and the entire community going from relative affluence and comfort and everyone doing quite well to grinding in severe poverty with simply no jobs, where the economic heart was ripped out of the community. So these are very difficult things to overcome. We shouldn't do this by rooting ourselves in the past or with outdated technology. We should be looking to get ahead. We should be looking at micro mills, small mills. We should be looking at innovative ways of making steel. We should be looking at being world beating. What we shouldn't be looking at doing is either lumping government bailouts or allowing our industry to be the victim of some other government's inappropriate and unwise bailing out of their industry.
Now, you wanted to highlight this article because tell us a little bit about how this Tata Steel situation leaves the Scottish Government with liability for clean-up costs.
Yes, there's a particular Scottish angle. Scotland went through a huge amount of closure, including Ravenscraig, which was the big mill in Motherwell. It closed back in the 90s, I think. And there was a big divestment of jobs out of Scotland from steel making, but there are still several hundred jobs in 3 Tata factories left in Scotland, the DL plate mill being the best known, also in Motherwell. Now, these were also closed. The Scottish Government got involved, and then they announced that there was a buyer. But strangely, the Scottish Government was buying all of the assets from Tata, and then the Scottish Government was selling those same assets to the final owner for the same amount of money. And that seemed a strange thing to do. Why are they doing that? Well, of course, what's happening is the state is picking up all the long-term liabilities onto the taxpayer's purse. In this case, the environmental cleanup obligations. I'm not sure whether this also includes pension obligations. Time will tell on that one. But basically, there is a government bailout in Scotland, which is seeing the Scottish industry find a buyer.
Yes, because some of the newspapers today were suggesting that pensioners would not receive their money following whatever deal is going to be done here. What do you have any view on that?
Well, it's always a difficult thing because you have these company pension schemes, often very generous, often final salary schemes, and going back with a large organisation like this that goes back to Chorus, to British Steel Corporation, to Stewarts and Lloyds. You know, there'll be people in here that started in very different organisations, but they'll have built up this pension entitlement. But is the pension money actually there? Is it protected? Is it safe? Or are they going to find themselves without that support that they've paid in for and they had expected to be there for them in their retirement?
Indeed. And you mentioned micro steel mills a few minutes ago.
Yes, I mean, this is the coming technology and it's all very new, but what you're seeing is steel being manufactured on a much smaller, much cleaner, much lower capital investment basis. So you're seeing these micro and mini steel mills return 3-4 times the return on capital that the big mills do, and you're having an industry based on this type of technology, which has the potential to be much lighter on its feet, much more able to cope with the swings which are inevitable in the steel industry. There's always been swings because it's involved with construction. Construction tends to be very hard hit by the business cycle. We can discuss later on why that is, but this is an industry that requires to be able to be flexible, and new technology, new developments. That will be the way forward, not government bailouts, nationalisation, or any of the other things that are being bandied around at the moment.
Like this.
Yes, I thought that it is something we should contemplate, that if this was the banking industry and not the steel industry, they wouldn't hesitate. They would take your money, Mike, mine, our children's money, and they would throw it at the banking industry, because the banking industry is sacrosanct. Unfortunately, the steel industry is not. Now, I don't think the steel industry should be sacrosanct.
But then the banking industry shouldn't be either.
I definitely think the banking industry shouldn't be sacrosanct, and if they're bust, they're bust, in my humble opinion.
Now, unfortunately, kind of related, I suppose, India had a disaster. Was this yesterday that this happened?
Yes, this was yesterday. There's a flyover collapsed onto a crowded street. Lots of people killed, lots of people injured and trapped. A terrible tragedy. And I think something that is worth just briefly looking at what might have happened here.
So you wanted us to look at this image?
Yes. Now, I've only seen a few photographs coming in. I am a structural engineer, and I'm obviously interested in what might have gone so terribly wrong here. And the area I've circled there shows a central support in between the two flyover structures and two arms which appear to be tapering. And they've collapsed down. Now, what that would appear to be is a central support with two cantilever steel box girders holding the flyover decks. Now, you see the collapse and crushing at the top of the pier there. That looks to me to be a buckling and crushing failure of a steel box girder. Now, there was a history of this back in the 70s with steel box girder bridges, including one in Milford Haven, and one in Germany and one in Australia. That all failed with similar sorts of failure. So you're seeing a buckling failure there, and then that having failed, the supporting arms then collapse, and the road decks have no more support and fall onto the street below. So based on the little information we have at the moment, that's what seems to have happened. A design error, in all probability, is the root cause of that. The other photograph that flashed up here, this is the same flyover a little while ago, a different part of the same structure, also collapsing. So there would appear to be serious problems with this project, to put it mildly.
Yes, indeed. Right. Let's move on. Israel, and you wanted to highlight the fact that Mr. Netanyahu had put this out yesterday. So this is a strong Israel prevents the passage of masses of refugees to Europe. The world would be different if we were not here.
Yes, I think this is the most significant tweet I have ever seen. Now, it's strange that we're seeing prime ministers of countries putting out geopolitical strategic statements on Twitter, but that's what's happened here. And we're seeing a very significant case being made by Israel to Europe that we are your gatekeeper. Now, that is an appeal for support, financial and military, now and in the future. That's what that is, quite clearly. And it's forming an alliance between Israel and Europe. And I think that's a very important and significant point, and it's worth noting. And that will play ever larger in the years to come.
But it wasn't the only tweet he was putting out. Israel, Greece, Cyprus cooperation makes us more secure and prosperous. It's long overdue, but it's happening now at a very rapid pace. And there is great importance.
Just before we go on to that one, just one at a time, if you don't mind, Mike. That previous one there was Cyprus, right? That one there. So what they're saying there is we've got a bridge being formed, right? Greece, Cyprus, Israel, that's the route the plane takes if you're going there. Greece, Cyprus, Israel, that is a land and sea bridge between Europe and Israel. So that's the geo part of the geopolitical deal here. And we're seeing here, he's saying it's happening at a rapid pace, and I suspect that's, if anything, an understatement.
Do you think, David, that the use of Twitter to put out a strategic message like this is a sign that there's some turbulence in the normal political channels?
It could well be. It does seem a strange way of doing it. It's not an announcement. It's not a press conference. It's not a paper. It's a tweet. I mean, maybe these other things are happening as well, but it does seem odd. If you could also, Mike, there was another slide there which showed a book, just very briefly, if I can mention. This is the book, Anzac's Empires and Israel's Restoration, written by an Australian Scottish extraction called Kelvin Crombie, who was working for about 25 years at Christ Church in Jerusalem, which is just inside the Jaffa Gate, basically where that photograph in the cover of the book is taken. And he is obviously knows Israel very well. He's very sympathetic towards the idea of Jewish return to Israel, Jewish return to the land. But this book is well worth a read. It covers a very important aspect, which is the Levant is the land between empires. It's extremely strategic, and it always has been. And because it sits between empires, it has either the ability to play one empire off against another, get support from one empire against another, or it can be crushed in between. And both things have happened. It's a very interesting history. It's a very well written book. The gentleman is Australian, and he was particularly interested in the Australian role in the First World War with the Light Horse, etc., in expelling the Turks from the Middle East, and all the campaign that the British and Empire forces did to liberate that country. And but the book starts much earlier. It starts with sort of Napoleonic era and how the interaction of empires affects that particular part of the world. A very interesting book. I thoroughly recommend that.
Okay. And we will move on now. Charges against an IDF soldier.
Yes, this is the other tweet which I interrupted you was Bibi Netanyahu saying that Israel is a stabilizing force in the Middle East. Now, to contrast that, I raised this one. This is an IDF soldier who was caught on film executing a wounded and apparently unconscious knife attacker by shooting him in the head.
And that's this image, is that right?
No, that's another image.
Oh, okay.
The actual shooting in the head is particularly grim. I mean, it is obviously on the internet, but it was quite callous, and it seemed to be utterly unnecessary because the man, he had been engaged in a knife attack. I mean, the chap was by no means an innocent party. But he was, at this point, he'd been shot and he was lying unconscious on the ground, and he was clearly no further threat at that time. So it's a callous act, and it's now how that's been handled, both by the Israeli authorities and also by Israeli public opinion, which is solidly behind the soldier and viewing even an investigation, let alone a trial, as completely unnecessary. So you're seeing here a very hardened public opinion, and likely to be more so in the face of the ongoing violence.
David, perhaps I could just say to that, isn't it interesting that there's this hardline stance? You can simply just shoot somebody, but we've had several tranches of British police actually going to Israel to be trained in procedures and how to deal with policing, in inverted commas, in turbulent areas. I just wonder.
Yes, that is very bizarre. Why anyone in Britain? Because it's an entirely different situation. It's an unarmed society. It's a much more peaceful society, and it's a much less divided society. The divisions, even just in the Jewish community in Israel, are enormous. It's a very divided country, and it's very much a powder keg. I can understand why they might want to come to Britain to see maybe how we've handled things with, less loss of life. I really can't see why we're sending people there.
Unless it's to be desensitised, and perhaps we'll come on to that another time.
But this RT article that you wanted to highlight, the Palestinian terror group, launches dramatic video after IDF killing of injured stabber. The other point that I wanted to highlight about this, of course, is that video has already been taken down, allegedly for violating YouTube's terms of service. But tell us about this.
Yes, the legal defence was interesting. It just shows you the nature of legal defences. The legal defence was, well, the autopsy will be very critical here because, this is the lawyer speaking on behalf of the soldier, because if it showed that the initial wounds that the attacker received were in fact mortal and he would have died anyway, then my client is off the hook. So apparently, if it's a dying man, you can shoot them in the head and be entirely free from any legal repercussions. That struck me as a very strange comment to be coming out of a legal system. The nature of the public response was concerning as well. That there isn't a concern for this sort of behaviour, and there's an acceptance of this. Harsh isn't really the word. Brutal treatment of injured men. I mean, yes, the chap was trying to stab someone. He's by no means innocent, but we're meant to be living in a society governed by the rule of law, which means you don't shoot an unconscious man in the head because you didn't like what he did before.
But perhaps this quote from Ben Gurion gives a clue.
Yes, I thought this was very, very telling. Do you have, actually, it's worth just reading out in full. I don't know if you can actually see the whole thing in full, if I've got a version. Yes, I can. I've got a version here. Right, this is Ben Gurion speaking in a cabinet meeting around about 1951. He said, this is the first Prime Minister of Israel and founder of the state. Until a Jewish soldier is hanged for murdering Arabs, these acts of murder won't end. Israel's first Prime Minister told a stunned cabinet 66 years ago. This is Haaretz reporting, when Jewish murders of Arabs had become all too common. Ben Gurion continued, in general, those who have guns use them, Ben Gurion asserted, adding that some Israelis, quote, think Jews are people, but Arabs aren't, so you can do anything to them. And some think it's a mitzvah, that's a holy requirement, to kill Arabs, and that everything the government says against murdering Arabs isn't serious, that it's just a pretense that killing Arabs is forbidden. But in fact, it's a blessing because there will be fewer Arabs. As long as they think that, the murders won't stop. David Ben Gurion, founder of the State of Israel, first Prime Minister, speaking in the Israeli cabinet 66 years ago.
What do we say?
Probably nothing. The silence does it all, I think, really.
Okay, let's move on. Upcoming events. So UK Column monthly meeting on the 20th of this month. It's always the third Wednesday of the month in the George in Plymouth, which is in Plympton. And then on the 7th of May, Brian, State of the Nation in Cornwall. You'll be speaking, Ian Crane will be speaking. And
it's going to be a very interesting event, Mike, because a lot of work been put in by the Penzance team in particular, and they are saying that many people in Cornwall are beginning to get very interested in what's actually starting to go on around them. So we're looking for a very good turnout for that, and a reward, as it were, for all the hard work put in by the people down there in Penzance and surrounding areas.
Yeah, and then on the 13th of May, of course, AV7. So you can find the list of upcoming events on the community section of the UK Column website. So what's next?
Well, it's very simple. There's been a sort of announcement update all of a sudden from Justice Goddard, so everything gone very quiet on the so-called Goddard inquiry. But The Guardian's got this very interesting article, Children in Lambeth Council's Care Abused on an Industrial Scale. Now, this language has been used before by the police, but it's interesting that it's now coming into Justice Goddard's work. And let's just remember that this judge is effectively unaccountable. She's got no police experience herself of investigations, and she's carrying out what? A probe. The thing is, we do not know what this woman is doing, but what we do know is that it's industrial scale abuse. And this is just fascinating language. The consequences mean many vulnerable children continue to suffer at the hands of paedophiles who had infiltrated Lambeth Council because they knew they could peddle their evil. So we've got industrial abuse of children made possible because the paedophiles are inside the child protection system, and there is still no police investigation going on. It's a single judge doing what she pleases behind closed doors. But there's been a reassurance because the council, Ben Emerson QC, has said the former government minister Paul Boateng had connections to the paedophile Michael Carroll, who ran the Angel Road home where children were abused. That'll all be examined, but the inquiry had so far seen nothing to corroborate any allegations of impropriety by Mr. Boateng. So you can make of that what you will, but let's just remember we've got an appointed judge who is unaccountable, and she now seems to be replacing Britain's police force in the grounds of investigations. And we've got the industrial abuse of children by paedophiles who are inside the child protection system. So let's come back to this lady, the brave Lancashire child abuse whistleblower, Carol Woods. She says she was asked to falsify child protection records so that children could be taken away from totally innocent parents. She was asked to do this on more than one occasion. When she stands up and says no and blows the whistle, she's bullied, harassed, arrested by the police, has her home stolen and is locked up in a psychiatric system. So let's remember what Carol Woods has been saying. We remember what they're saying around the Goddard inquiry. The paedophiles are inside the child protection system. Well, are they actually running it? That's my question. Is what really happening? And if you want to know how it's possible that somebody can simply be pulled off the street into a psychiatric system with no proper records or procedure, then we need to be looking at Lancashire NHS Foundation Trust. And these are the individuals running the board. These are the people who should be questioned. This is the chief executive. We'll just show you her, Professor Heather Tierney-Moore. These are the individuals that need to answer the key question: how is it possible that somebody is taken off the streets and unlawfully incarcerated in the psychiatric system in order, it would appear, to close the lid on whistleblowing of child stealing? It's pretty obvious what's going on. David, if it's happening south of the border, this can explain easily, of course, what's happening north of the border.
It's happening north of the border, and it's been denied north of the border. We're seeing ongoing debates here regarding the named person scheme, which constantly revolve around one side accusing parents of being paedophiles and saying the state requires insight into every aspect of your family life in order to protect children from their parents. And the No to Name Person campaign is pointing out that this is a gross misrepresentation, that the state itself constitutes the biggest single risk to children, and that we need to make sure we do not remove power from loving parents to protect their own kids.
Lancashire County Council didn't want to make a statement.
No, we did contact them this morning and asked them if they wanted to make a statement, and they said, of course, they'll come back to us, but they haven't come back to us. So I've got to say that Carol Woods, amazing lady, and the evidence that she has is just incredible. Document after document, perjury, lies, cover-up, bullying, intimidation. This lady needs the full support of the British public in order to keep her testimony out in the open. And of course, if she can be put in psychiatric units to shut her up, it's being done to other people. We know that children are being stolen to order. What are they being used for? Sexual abuse by paedophiles, that's one thing. But the other topic that keeps coming up more and more is body parts. And maybe the next subject sort of moves us on for this. We've got the Spectator talking on eugenics, the return of eugenics. Well, very interesting article. Encourage people to go and read it. It's unclear as to whether this is pro or against. because it has a bit of both in it. But one of the interesting things that The Spectator is doing is quoting itself back in 1912, when essentially there was a pro-eugenics article. But what the article does say is that there has been considerable protest by professionals who say that all the procedures to experiment on fetuses, and particularly and to carry out a whole range of experiments. I don't think we need to go into them live, but there are people with deep concern about this, and they're saying that it isn't a question of regulating the whole procedure, it needs to be stopped in its tracks. So I'm not sure what The Spectator's up to here, because there is a little bit of both sides of the argument, but on the other hand, they're now flagging up that Britain is leading the world back into the subject of eugenics. David?
Yes, it's a very, very worrying area. There's an excellent book on this subject that follows in detail the advancement of the eugenics so-called science from the late 1900s in England. A relative of Darwin called Galton was the originator. And it then moved to America, and it had its finest flowering there, or most destructive flowering there. And the book follows this in detail. The book is called War Against the Weak. It's a fascinating and dreadful read, and it illustrates how complete fakery in terms of science, there was nothing backing this up, was used as an excuse in Britain, in the United States, and then subsequently in Germany. So all the leading so-called enlightened countries in the world for having the most dreadful abuse of those in our society who are unable to defend themselves.
Okay, let's move on. You mentioned named person a couple of minutes ago. The first article we've got here, this is the leader of the Conservative Party, is that right?
This is the leader of the Labour Party, Kezia
right.
Dugdale. Kezia Dugdale was solidly in favour of the named person scheme. It was grand. She was a little concerned about the way the SNP were administrating it, but it was, apart from the administration, it was a wonderful idea, and now she's realised it's not. So we should applaud that. It's a bit late in the day. She voted for it, and she supported it up until 2 days ago, and now she doesn't.
What changed her mind?
I think that's called Scottish public opinion. This is it's becoming a major part of the election campaign here. It's all over the press. More and more information is coming out, and people are realising that this is totalitarian, and they are less than happy.
And Ruth Davidson saying that the named person scheme could end in tragedy.
Yes, she's calling on the whole scheme to be stopped and re-examined, which is a wise course of action. The Conservatives opposed the named person part of this bill. They abstained in the main bill, but they opposed the named person part from the outset. And one of the Conservative MSPs has been instrumental in the No to Named Person campaign from the outset. That's Liz Smith. She's been very firm and consistent in opposing this all the way along the line, and now the whole Conservative Party is doing likewise, and we are seeing now the Labour Party as well. So the political leadership is slowly swinging into line behind the grassroots movement, and that's good to see.
And the important lesson is the power of public opinion, just quiet but measured public opinion with sufficient
yes, determined,
numbers.
consistent, making the arguments, doing the intellectual work, getting the message out, and doing so consistently, because the No to Named Person campaign has been running now for 18 months, 2 years, something like that. And it started off, it wasn't getting anything like this amount of attention. It's building all the time, and it's turning into a major election campaign issue. The questions are now being put to the government, to the nationalist government, and the answers are coming back, and the answers are quite interesting.
Sorry, Nicola Sturgeon, a bit confused
yes, you
apparently
could bring
here.
that next slide up, thanks. This is Nicola Sturgeon. Now, what she said was, in fact, she's being reassuring, in fact, the named person will only give advice at the request of a parent or a young person. So what have you got to worry about, Mike? There's nothing to see here. Well, actually, there is, because if you go to the Act, the actual legislation, it says the named person will decide for themselves what they do. And if you go to the guidance, the draft statutory guidance, it says the named person, when they consider it appropriate to promote, support, or safeguard the well-being of a child or young person, and well-being is everything, they'll go forward and they will advise the child or advise the parent, and that they can do this either when they're asked to by the parent, or when
it's actually
in the
David, I'll help you out here, because we've put up the main part of that text. I think the bit you want to quote is actually just on the bottom of the screen. But it is that section that actually says that the named person.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. It says the named person will take action, will provide this support and advice if the named person identifies a well-being need, or if others provide information or raise concerns about the child's well-being.
Yeah.
So there you have a clear statement in the guidance that the named person can act and get involved in family life if they perceive a well-being need, or if anyone else in the entire world makes a report about you or your kin.
But we still don't have a definition for well-being.
And there's no definition for well-being. And Nicola Sturgeon is saying quite clearly that this can only happen if you or your child requests it. That would be misleading, lying, barefaced lying to the Scottish public, I would suggest. I think that might go badly for her.
And you wanted to highlight your article on the Mises Institute website.
Yes, this is a piece that I've written, inspired by an earlier piece by Schoolhouse, the home education charity, and it's bought and sold for Gurfek Gold: How Government Buys the Third Sector Allegiance. It goes through how the all of the charities, it identifies all the charities that are supporting the named person legislation, shows how much money they are receiving, and it totals something like 2.2 million a year, and the reasons that they are so supportive of the legislation and can see nothing wrong with it is that they are financially compromised. They are in fact acting as an adjunct to the state, a new arm of the state. They are not independent, and the word charity is simply putting people to sleep on asking the right questions about who these people are, what their agenda are, what their incentives are, and whether they can be trusted.
Well, I just wanted to draw people's attention to this from the Early Intervention Foundation, because, of course, when can the named person intervene? It's when somebody makes some kind of comment about the well-being of the child. And this report from the Early Intervention Foundation they're saying they've carried out a review of, quote, what works to enhance interparental relationships and improve outcomes for children. And what they're basically saying is, well, I'll just quote it here: the quality of interparental relationships, specifically how parents communicate and relate to each other, is increasingly recognized as a primary influence on the effective parenting practices and children's long-term mental health and future life chances. And so this really comes back to the whole issue of what is the definition of well-being and when can somebody step in. So if two people are having a heated discussion, that is now affecting the mental health of the child, and of course that would come under the term well-being, I'm quite sure.
That would come under the term well-being, and that would be more than enough information to start information gathering, and for the state to become involved and to start to be changing the outcome for the child by imposing compulsion on the family. So if you have a row with your wife, it's tantamount to child abuse, and the government will treat it accordingly.
Okay. Well, before we move on and end on the wonderful subject of war, which of course the government is continually peddling, we've got this interesting comment here on microchipping. If only one child is saved by it, it'll be worth it. There's some extraordinary stuff going on at the moment over social media.
There is. This is Ian McWhirter, who's actually been quite good on name person. He's been revealing a lot of the concerns, and he's coming from a political starting point that might be expected to be supportive, and he's saying no, there's many problems with this. He's referring here to a Huntigauk, an April Fool's article in his newspaper. So on one level, what you've got here is legislation that's so extreme that you can make an April Fool's joke about having compulsory microchipping of every child. And in fact, they made that April Fool's joke into a full article in The Scotsman. I think, Brian, you see though there's a bit more to it than that.
Well, I just think it was an extremely unpleasant little trick, because the named person scheme is a very serious topic. It's to do with the safety of our children. And I don't think the topic is suitable to be made into some 1984 April Fool's joke, because that article was very well constructed. I think part of the article was designed to nudge people into thinking that the whole of the named person scheme, nothing to worry about, all a little bit of a joke. I think there was some really devious journalism in that article, but maybe it's just me.
Well, you could be right, but there's several things happening maybe at the same time, because on one level, it is so extreme and so totalitarian, it is being mocked, and the mockery is our friend. But you're right, you have to watch where that goes, and it doesn't become acceptance or making a joke of a serious matter.
Okay, shall we move on to war then?
It should be war, traditionally.
Yes, so Philip Hammond was in Lebanon yesterday. Well, what did he have to say? He said the UK and Lebanon have strong and long-standing relationship. In meetings with the country's leaders, I reaffirmed the UK's support for a secure, stable and prosperous Lebanon, although we might bomb it a bit. That's basically what he said. There's only a little bit of April Fools in that. He didn't say they would bomb it a bit, but he certainly didn't rule out bombing Lebanon to deal with ISIS, apparently. So he's saying that Britain is prepared to consider airstrikes against Islamic State in Lebanon. I'm sure the Lebanese would be delighted with that. He said, we very much regard the survival and success of the Lebanese state as a vital part of the security architecture, not only of the region, but also the security architecture that protects us in Europe. So there you go. We might bomb it a bit. But in the meantime, of course, the United States is bringing more arms and armaments right up to the Russian border. This is the European Reassurance Initiative. And that is supposed to reassure everybody in Europe. It's brilliant.
It's not reassuring me, Mike.
Well,
actually.
Indeed. So 250 tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Paladin self-propelled howitzers, 1,700 wheeled vehicles and trucks. They'll be there by next February. And, well, this is going to the Eastern Front, which, of course, is Russia's western border. Well...
They had a few problems there some years ago, apparently.
Well, indeed. But anyway, yesterday then, Obama welcomed lots of people from foreign countries to the Nuclear Security Summit that opened yesterday in Washington. He said, I've ruled out developing new nuclear warheads and narrowed the contingencies under which the United States would ever use or threaten to use nuclear weapons, which is all a bit strange because, as the Financial Times is reporting here, Obama's plans for a new nuclear arsenal are raising fears of a new arms race. And this is $350 billion or so that are already intending to be spent on nuclear weapons modernization, and some people talking about a total of $1 trillion being spent over the next few years. And William Perry, of course, who was former Secretary of Defense, saying we're heading towards a new Cold War, a new arms race. Well, I think the way we're going, we're heading for a bit more than that. And it's not just Russia that is the target, of course, as we've been pointing out, because the UK continues to sidle up to China's borders as well. And North Korea is the excuse, of course. Obama's narrative is that all of the neighboring countries around China need the United States to protect them from an increasingly, well, particularly after nuclear weapons tests by North Korea was the excuse. At the Nuclear Weapons Summit, Obama taking advantage of that to meet with President Xi Jinping. And of course, this is discussions, if we want to put that in inverted commas, over the islands in the South China Sea, the island building. So what can we say? It just continues to build up. And in the meantime, we've continuing activity within China itself. So we've seen the financial attacks on China recently, the attacks on their currency, which they seem to have batted off. And now it looks like we've got attempts to incite a sort of color revolution type scenario within China itself. And of course, if the Chinese government would react to that, as they are reacting to it, they get allegations of witch hunts and being draconian and this kind of thing. And the hypocrisy from Western media and governments is palpable. Yes.
Okay, well, we'll just end with this one. Encourage people to go and read this article. It's extremely detailed. It's zero hedge. And this is all about governments admitting in a variety of sources, so written, public, whatever, but this is going back to evidence-based material where it's showing that much of modern history has been manipulated by false flag attacks. So attacks, bombings, small-scale warfare started and blamed on somebody else. And there's teacher in the classroom actually pointing out that this is how it's done, a horrific staged event which you blame on a political enemy. So I encourage people to go and have a look at that. It's a really excellent article. And David, just 30 seconds for any final roundup comments from you.
On the false flag, I encourage people to go and look into Gulf of Tonkin, and of course, never forget the USS Liberty.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I was actually trying to get your grandfather up again because I felt a little bit sad that we couldn't show him, but I've lost him in the order there somewhere. We will make sure that he goes up. My problem, David, is all Scotsmen look alike to me, so I couldn't pin him down at all.
We realised this. You were confusing me with a Hieland coup some episodes again. So at least you got a man.
Indeed, that's true. Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all of our listeners and viewers. If you like what we do, please consider donating or taking out a subscription. We need your support to keep going. And that's about it, I think.
We'll be back on Monday.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.